Now that we're in the narrative of Southeastern Indians living in Indian territory, we've established Indian territory and we are fully into the 1830s and the 1840s. I want to talk about what life is like in Indian territory, what kind of adjustments these tribes have to make post Indian removal. And so this particular lecture is known as the Indian Frontier or the Five Republics. So we're going to start by talking about where they're located, and I want you to be familiar with where they are in terms of their location, how they relate to each other, in terms of geographically. And so keep in mind that there are other outside tribes that are there, but at this point, post 1830, post Trail of Tears, you have the Indian Territory dominated by the southeastern tribes. You'll notice on the west side of Indian Territory, so oh, I don't know what happened. Hang on. So you'll notice on the west side of the map, you've got the Kiowa and the Comanche and the Apache. They'll only show up by 1865. So don't be distracted by that just yet. This is a map that begins, you'll notice, in 1855. So this is really just to show you primarily where the southeastern tribes are. But remember, as I told you in the previous lecture, that this is about showing you where the main southeastern tribes are. But remember, you have tribes that are moved here from the Midwest. You also have other tribes who are moved here as well. So keep that in mind. Now, when we talk about the southeastern tribes, once they get here, they have to essentially start all over. Um, they decide that they are going to have to reset up their government and their rules of law. So, I want to talk about what their constitutions look like. They go through this process of governmental reconstruction, and I want to kind of start by talking about what that governmental reconstruction looks like. Let's begin by talking about the Choctaw government. So, they've they show up in Indian territory and they will write the first constitution in the history of Indian territory, and thereby the first constitution in Oklahoma history, right? It is for them their second constitution. So it's established in 1834, and it is a government with three branches. It is Their three branches are a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. So it sounds exactly like what the United States has. So in terms of their legislative branch, it's unicameral, so it has just the one house. It's a unicameral council with 10 council members. Their executive branch has three district chiefs. Their district chiefs are elected, and their judicial branch is made up of three appointed judges. And also, in terms of their judicial branch, they have law enforcement that is a part of their judicial branch. So there are 18 elected light horsemen. So, in other words, their law enforcement is elected. There's 18 of them. Within their constitution, they also have a Bill of Rights. And in terms of who gets to vote, you have, in terms of suffrage, you have to be 16 years old and you have to be a man. So 16-year-old men are eligible to vote, but uh, they are extremely detailed and structured and modeled after the United States. The second constitution is modeled is from the Chickasaw government. The Chickasaw government actually is established by the 4,900 Chickasaws who went to Indian Territory after 1837. Here's the thing. The 4,900 Chickasaws who went to Indian Territory after 1837, these guys were actually about to become citizens of the Choctaw government. They were so few in number that they just decided, you know what, we might as well join in with the Choctaws. But what ends up happening is after several years, by 1855, they decided, oh, excuse me, after 1855, they sign a treaty with the Choctaws to establish their own independence. And after establishing their own independent government, they create a constitution that's essentially identical to the Choctaw government. So just think of their government um, similar to what the Choctaw has. The Creek will create a constitution um, really completely brand new, because when the Creek come in, and hopefully you guys remember this, but remember, they don't have a tradition of a constitution, because if you go back in their history, remember, this is a tribe that has a lot of um anger and hostility towards the idea of, you know, assimilation and adopting these new ideas of, you know, white government and governance in general. And remember, you have a deep division, one between the Lower Creeks and the Upper Creeks, right? So the Lower Creeks, remember, in um 1826, they're the ones who show up in Indian Territory. And then you have the Upper Creeks in 1836. They're the ones who are forced here, who kind of show up um because they really have no choice. The Upper Creeks will have a much larger number. The Lower Creeks, when they show up in 1826, there are only 2,500 of them. When the Upper Creeks show up, there are 15,000 of them. 15,000. So 15,000 to 2,500, you would think naturally the Upper Creeks would demand more power. They would demand the leadership and that sort of thing. That's actually not what happens at all. When the Upper Creeks show up in 1836, which is 10 years after the Lower Creeks arrive, the Upper Creeks actually defer leadership to the Lower Creeks. And so here's what the Creeks establish. The Creeks establish their first, essentially, a decentralized government. So the Creeks will essentially create 50 towns throughout their confederation, throughout their land. 50 towns where each town will have a principal chief and a second chief. And with a decentralized government, it means each town will have most of their power with the principal chief and the second chief. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't any kind of national council. There is. And in fact, the principal chief and the second chief would represent their towns in the, regional, upper town council, or a regional lower town council meeting. So, once a year or twice a year, if a regional upper town council took place, then your principal chief and your second chief would go to those meetings. There's also a national council Creek meeting. There's the national council would come together and meet. But the thing is, the National Council did not hold the power. In other words, for the United States, we have the federal government, and the federal government holds the highest or the main power. That's not the case here. Here, the National Council is essentially saying, okay, here's the update. Just want to see how you guys are doing. Is this the case all around? It doesn't hold any real power. The real power is with the towns themselves, right? The real power is with the principal chiefs and the second chiefs. You as a principal chief and a second chief, you all determine how the town is run, right? So there is no centralized power. The first written constitution for the Creek government is written in 1859. So it's not for another 20 years after the Upper Creeks arrive in Indian Territory that a constitution is written. And it's really sort of reflective of the division that still exists within the Creek tribe. That's the thing. The fact that a national constitution or a tribal constitution is not written until 1859 is reflective of that division. And I want you to keep that in mind, because the fact that it takes 23 years for this constitution to be written sort of shows that you have a division, even though the Upper Creeks still defer leadership to the Lower Creeks, and they all sort of agree, okay, we're just going to mind our business and live amongst ourselves. um, it shows the fact that they're not comfortable with each other. They're not comfortable with the idea of identifying themselves as all one Creek nation. Um, it's indicative of how long and how deep those divisions are. So that is something that you need to be mindful of, because remember, 1859, we're only 2 years away from the Civil War. And that's something that you've got to remember for what's about to come. Now, that leads me to the Seminole government. Of the 5 southeastern tribes, the Seminoles have the least organized government. The federal government wants them, and there's 4,000 of them, to become a part of the Creek tribe. But the Creek tribe have their own issues. That's one thing. And the other thing is the Seminole don't want that, because the Seminole, and this is fair, the Seminole have no interest in this, because the Seminole believe that joining with the Creek would rob the Seminole of their own identities. And uh, they are afraid, the Seminole are afraid, that they could lose their slaves, they could lose their property, they could lose all sorts of things. They could lose their power. And so the Seminole make an argument that uh, that is not at all what they're interested in. And so they form a government, but it's in name only. It's really just to sort of satisfy the U.S. federal government in saying, we've created a government, can you leave us alone now? It's not really to actually have a functioning government. It's just to be able to get the US federal government off of their back. So of course, as a result, this is going to be the most problematic, right? Because the Seminoles are going to be the most difficult to really negotiate with in terms of treaties and agreements, because if you don't have a real functioning government, then how do you have any kind of real meeting? How do you know who to negotiate with? Who's going to be the representative? Who's going to be the real leader? You don't really know, as the federal government will find out. Then, of course, there is the Cherokee government. The Cherokee government is of course, going to be really interesting, primarily because of their own deep division and their own um, political situation. When we talk about the Cherokee, of course, you have the early arrivals with the Treaty Party, and then you have the late arrivals or the new arrivals with John Ross. So in 1839, John Ross arrives with 11,500 Cherokees, and they meet up with the 5,000 Cherokees who are already here. And so the question is, okay, will John Ross and the 11,500 Cherokees meet up and just establish or participate with the already established government? And John Ross says, absolutely not. We have no interest in just merging ourselves with the already established government. John Ross says, we deserve a new constitution. Um, and then furthermore, keep in mind, it's not just the Cherokees who were from the Treaty Party, it's also the Western Cherokees who were from Arkansas. And those guys who were from the Western Cherokee don't want anything to do with John Ross because they don't really trust him anyway. Here's the other kicker that people aren't ready for, right? So the Western Cherokee have a problem with John Ross because John Ross is showing up and is demanding a new constitution, and he's making these assumptions that he's going to be treated as a leader and respected as one as well. But there's also punishment for the guys who signed the treaty in the first place. In 1839, which is the same year that John Ross and the 11,500 Cherokees show up, the members of the Treaty Party, um, these three men in particular, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, were all assassinated. So remember, the treaty that they signed, which was signed in 1835, was the legal basis for forcible removal, right? It's the legal basis for the Trail of Tears. It's the reason why, thousands of Cherokees end up dying on the way to Indian Territory. So these three men are seen as the ones who betrayed um, the rest of the tribe, and so as a result you have this establishment of what's known as a blood feud within the Cherokee tribe. And the blood feud is essentially this this rivalry that goes beyond politics, right? It's a rivalry that goes beyond you betrayed me for, loyalty to the government, loyalty to this. It is something that is it is literally just assassination after assassination after assassination, and it goes on for 7 years. And in the middle of this, John Ross finds himself calling for unity. And in fact, he tries to establish, or he tries to call for, a unity convention, um, which doesn't really work out too well when many of the Western Cherokees don't even show up. Western Cherokees actually supported the Ridges and Boudinot, um, and didn't like John Ross, like I said earlier, and we're like, who is this guy to call for an act of union, or an act of unity? So Ross, despite the fact that a lot of these Western Cherokees didn't show up, he calls for an act of union. And in this act of union, Ross says the Eastern Cherokees and the Western Cherokees have been unified. Well, just because you declare that to be true doesn't mean that it's actually true, right? So he calls for a second convention. And in the second convention, they create a new constitution that's really similar to their constitution from 1827. They meet for a third convention in 1840, this time with the Western Cherokees, where they ratified that organic law. And they established Tahlequah as their tribal capital. Tahlequah, if you don't know, is in northeastern Oklahoma, which is right in the central part of Cherokee Nation. That would be their official constitution for 66 years. Now, despite the fact that they have these unity conventions, despite the fact that they have this constitution and it would last as their official constitution for 66 years, does not mean that they are unified. Does not mean that John Ross has the support of his people. It does not mean that this tribe has any real kind of strength in numbers in terms of you know, not even just unity, just in terms of peace. um it is a deeply divided tribe that goes back um to removal days. The damage that removal does, the damage that the ideas of assimilation does, goes back a long ways. It goes back generations, and it takes a lot of time to heal. And here's the thing, the Civil War is going to do a tremendous amount of damage. And that's the same story that the Creek will have. It's the same story that the Seminole will have. The Seminole won't have it as much as the Creek and the Cherokee, but it's something that you need to keep in mind as we go forward, that the tribes that have and suffer from division from the 1830s are going to keep it going for decades to come. And that's something that you need to be mindful of. Now, when we talk about, let me go forward because you've seen all of that now. When we go forward economically, um, economics is gonna play a real role here too. When we talk about how members of the tribe believe the tribe should earn money, or what the tribe should be in terms of their economic identity, that's going to be a really interesting source of division as well. There are going to be traditionalists in each um, tribe who believe very strongly in this agricultural um, identity. And these traditionalists are going to automatically establish um, farms and try to set up new farm sites here in Indian Territory. But the problem is that um, they are going to try and set up, you know, different types of farms here, and realize very quickly that Indian Territory is not going to be ideal for the types of agriculture that they are used to setting up, because the southeastern United States is not the same as Indian Territory, right? Furthermore, where they're living is completely different, right? Depending on where they are in terms of the tribe. I mean, keep in mind, if you go back to the second slide, and you can do so at the end of this lecture, but their tribes, their nations are covering a tremendous amount of territory that covers a large amount of land. And even then, you have a whole lot of geography that covers a different type of climate. I mean, eastern Oklahoma is vastly different from western Oklahoma. And if you've driven across the state, you know that it's very different. Western Oklahoma is drier, it's browner. There are less trees. It's significantly different. Northeastern Oklahoma is different from southwestern Oklahoma. The Panhandle is different. Southeastern Oklahoma is different from central from central Oklahoma and that sort of thing. Um, so it's all different. The other thing that you've got to keep in mind is that um, the weather is going to be a little bit more unpredictable. And so that's going to be a challenge for traditionalists. So traditionalists themselves are challenged in a lot of ways by Indian Territory because of the weather and because of the soil as well. Slavery plays a huge role with Southeastern tribes. And this is going to be very important for you to remember. You're going to read about this in the first chapter of the book Main Street, Oklahoma. But I'm going to give you a preview of it now. Slavery is brought into Indian Territory by the Southeastern tribes. It is what makes Indian Territory unique from every other slaveholding state in the United States. Notice I am pausing so that I can make sure you write that down. Slavery is introduced into Indian Territory by the Southeastern tribes, not by white slave owners. For example, the reason why that's important is because in Texas, when slavery is introduced, it is introduced by white people, by white slave owners. That's not the case in Indian Territory. It is introduced by the Southeastern tribes. And so when we have slaves brought in by the Southeastern tribes, it is a unique experience to the territory. And when we talk about the roles of slaves, it is important that you remember slaves are adopted. These are black slaves now. We're not talking about Indian captives or Indian slaves. We are talking about African Americans. We are talking about black slaves, right? Of all of the southeastern tribes, the Cherokees will have the most. The Cherokees will have 1,600 slaves. By 1860, there are a total of 8,300 slaves in Indian Territory. Um, and the other thing that you've got to keep in mind is that each tribe will have its own policy when it comes to slaves, right? So they don't have the same sort of belief system or the same sort of idea when it comes to slaves. It is not the same as the American belief or the American idea towards slaves, right? When we talk about American beliefs or American ideas about slavery, it's not the same as chattel slavery here. When we talk about native beliefs or native ideas towards slaves, one of the things I would recommend to you if you're more interested in exploring this is looking at the WPA narratives of the WPA slave narratives, and you'll hear or read about the experiences of slaves comparing what it was like to be a slave for native peoples versus white people. For example, to be a slave for a Creek owner versus a Seminole owner, or a Creek owner and a Seminole owner, slaves had personal property. Slaves acted as interpreters. Slaves moved about with relative freedom. So you could be a slave and have your own property, your own relative independence in terms of where you moved and how you moved. However, you still belonged to someone else. So there was an absence of freedom, right? You could not just leave and be your own person and do your own thing. That's the thing, right? You could not leave and live independently, right? So still technically you were a slave, right? But how you lived was different as opposed to being a slave under American law. Now, when we talk about, oh, I have it all listed there. When we talk about ranching, ranching is a brand new phenomenon when it comes or becomes a brand new phenomenon in Indian Territory, right? In Indian Territory, it's not to say that that Southeastern tribes were not familiar with this in the Southeast. They were, but in Indian Territory, it becomes much more popular and much more profitable. For the Creeks, they will raise cattle and hogs. For the Chickasaw, they will raise cattle, but also raise horses, sheep, goats. The Cherokee will have horses and mules, and they will all do incredibly well. And in fact, this is where they become this is where they will gain most of, if not all of their wealth. And so this is where slavery becomes really important for them, because this is where slaves will do most of their work. Tribes will also get involved in commercial development. So they will use the annuity payments that the government promises them and their agricultural profits to purchase goods that were imported by Indian merchants and white traders and develop their lands. And so what they end up doing is they just develop their land to create business. And they create their businesses throughout their tribal nations, all throughout Indian Territory. Um, these annuity payments and these profits become really important to them. What they decide to do, and this is really important, what they decide to do is essentially, if we're going to be stuck here, which it's clear that they're going to be stuck here, if we're going to be stuck here, we might as well take advantage of it, right? Um, and that's where these transportation networks become really important. So a lot is made about the American West and transportation networks in terms of wagon trails and military trails and that sort of thing. And I want to make something very clear here. So there are lots of stories about wagon trails and all of these trails that are developed that connect different communities together, that are developed all throughout the West. What I want to be clear about is that these are trails that are developed by Native Americans. Um, that's how it's always been. It's always been that way. And so the trails that are developed uh, early on, from the time we are talking, whether we're talking about the Oregon Trail or any other trail, they are developed by Native peoples. So in the 1850s, there are two trails that are significant to Indian Territory. One is the California Trail. The California Trail is an east west route that follows the Canadian River. Um, and let me see if I can highlight this for you. So, it would go along this right. So it's not quite highlighted here on this particular map, but I'm going to highlight it here for you, just sort of draw it along here, but it follows the Canadian River. So it'd be sort of like this, and it goes and it follows along this way, but it essentially goes all the way to California. And this is the thing, Oklahoma is always seen as a route to go east west, cut across, which is the same thing for the Butterfield Overland Mail route, which is highlighted here um, in this dotted line. So as you can see, Here's the dotted line, so you could follow it along either from going from St. Louis and starting here in Tipton or in Little Rock. But as it cuts along from Fort Smith, all the way across into Culver's Ferry, and then across Texas and going along and touching into El Paso, all the way across the border and into California. This route was important because it essentially goes all the way across into Los Angeles and it'll stretch up into San Francisco. These routes were important because it essentially created a new map for a new route for the mail. Um, it was about not just transportation, but it was about communication, right? There are routes developed, used to develop for the military. It's developed for communication and travel, as well as routes for there it is, for river transportation. One of the things that people don't realize about Oklahoma is we've got a lot of rivers, and the river routes are incredibly important as well. When we talk about the access to rivers and how they're important to us. So there are two that I want to highlight here. And those are the Red and Arkansas rivers. So the Red River, of course, you can see right at our border. Um, let me let me bring the red out real quick. So of course, here's the Red River right along our border, right there, as you can see. So the Red River, of course, is incredibly important because it doesn't just stretch across our border, but it goes all along through Arkansas. But here's the other border. The other significant river is, of course, the Arkansas River, which bridges into Arkansas this way, but it has all of these other tributaries as well. The Arkansas River is also incredibly important. And we've talked about this going back to the beginning of our lectures. But when we talk about how important they are, it sort of reaches into this idea of being able to connect with others going back into the early days of trade, right? When we talk about these transportation networks, whether it's with communication or with trade routes or with military access. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind is I am just sort of setting you up for these things to talk about or to have you keep in mind about what's coming up about the Civil War. That's all I really want you to keep in mind. It's just for Civil War strategic stuff. Okay. All right. So, that said, I want you to sort of shift gears a little bit and think about religion for a second. So, when we talk about the Southeastern Indians and um, talk about religion and consider religion, um, I, I want to I want to talk about religion now that we're in Indian territory. Um and why it becomes so important now. Um Religion, now that they've been forcefully removed to Indian territory, religious observances really become an attempt to regain a meaningful social life, a meaningful, purposeful life. Religion becomes a means for which they connect to something larger than themselves. Remember that everything that they have been through in the last 2 decades, right? Let's take it back even further. The last 3 decades in these policies of assimilation, changing their traditions, their policies, the way they dress, the rules of law, the way they live, their houses, the way they hunt, the everything that they've been doing. There has been a sense of identity loss. And religion helps to bring that back for them, right? So a part of them is brought back through these old sort of sacred rituals, right? So they bring back these sacred fires, and they bring back secret medicines, right? They go back to those traditional old belief systems that generations before held on to, because it helped them to identify with what, their grandparents, their great grandparents did. It connected them to something that made them who they were, and it was important to them. Now, um, Christianity does play a role here. Now, Christianity um, is going to play a role here in an attempt to help teach Christianity, obviously, right? Because we talked about Samuel Worcester, for example, trying to trans- translating the Bible into Cherokee language. But really, what Christianity is going to do is preserve language in helping to translate the Bible into Cherokee language or whatever, their, Seminole or Creek or whatever. While they don't always convert people, because the picture on the right, for example, is a picture of a Cherokee church from 1890. So some of these people do convert, and some of these people do become their version of Christians. But really, what Christianity accomplishes is the preservation of language. And that is really what religion does. Whether it's their original native religion or what Christianity does, is it helps to preserve their identity, their old identity, their real identity, not what they've assimilated to, but their real native identity. And that's what's really important here. Um so on that note, I want to talk about how that is going to be challenged. Um and that's going to matter quite a bit here. So with all of that said, we have to talk about um the the attempts to try and eliminate as much of the Indianness as possible. And that is attempted through educational reconstruction, right? So when we talk about formal education, the burden of formal education is placed squarely on the shoulders of these Christian missionaries. And that's been implied in previous lectures, but I want to emphasize that and say it directly in this particular lecture. The burden of that is on these Christian missionaries. And to be frank, it is their greatest it's their greatest contribution. Um, what these missionaries do is they go to these tribal nations, they go to these places and build schools. Um, and I've said this before, but this is where you're going to see the most cooperation among the tribes. The tribes are actually willing and open to the idea of bringing in these schools, bringing in these missionaries so that their children can be educated, not because they want their children to be like white people or like the Americans, but because they know their children are going to get better opportunities if they have these educational experiences. And so when we talk about what these missionaries do, missionaries come in and they build both schools and churches. And so when we talk about church attendance, you're not going to have a whole lot, right? But you are going to have schools that are packed. And it's boys and girls that are going to school. So it's welcome to, so it's for both genders, it's for everyone to attend. Church, not so much. But when we talk about how the tribes are responding and what the tribes do to make sure that the schools are there, it depends on the tribe. So, for example, the Choctaws in 1842, they used their treaty annuities to help build the schools. So, the boarding schools are financed by the treaty annuities, and they are staffed by different Christian mission boards. So, it's not just one. Um, Denomination. It's not just the Baptists, it's not just the Presbyterians or the Methodists. It's whoever shows up and whoever wants to work. It's different mission boards. They all come in and they all work. For the Chickasaws and the Creeks, by the 1850s, the Chickasaws had 5 schools and the Creeks had 3 schools. And the what's interesting here is that when we talk about the fact that the Creeks in particular were willing to have schools to educate their kids, that's pretty impressive, right? That's pretty interesting that they, of all 5 nations, were willing to have schools. Is really interesting. So, in terms of the schools themselves, all of the schools are going to have, situations where you send your children to school and they all come back. But then there are also situations where you have boarding schools where you send your children to school and they stay there, right? Those are the boarding schools. The boarding schools will all have the same curriculum and they all teach the same subjects, right? So math, history, Latin, Greek, philosophy, biology, astronomy, and of course, Bible. But they also offer vocational training. The vocational training is divided by gender. So boys were taught how to care for animals, how to raise crops, carpentry. So things that were considered appropriate for boys, outdoor work, that sort of thing. And then, of course, girls were taught cooking, sewing, childcare, anything that was considered domestic. That was for young girls. So you definitely have a very Christian influenced, white influenced, American influenced education there, right? But it is all sort of mixed in with these fundamental classes of math and history, Latin, Greek, science, all the sciences, mathematics and languages, and all of these other things that they would not be exposed to anywhere else. And so it's incredibly important and it's this wonderful opportunity. And that's why it becomes so much more important to them, right, to have their religious beliefs and practices come back, to be able to have something so fundamental like language and religion still practiced at home, so that they still have this core identity, that they could go by, that they remember who they are, at the end of the day, um, so that their source of Indianness is still very much there and that they don't lose it.